The day the island popped up a face, the lake smelled like fish rinds and wet rope, and the sun had teeth. It bit down through the thin clouds and made everything sting with light: the water, the rusting hinges on the old canoe, even the tiny flakes of mica in the dust along the footpath. I remember thinking that my toes looked like pale cassava slices in that brightness, pale and a little dusty, and that if I didn't watch where I put them, one of those spiky seed pods from the guasi bushes would pierce my heel and make me hop like a fool. Behind me I could hear the camp clacking awake, the metal mugs tapping, the Primus stove coughing, a voice calling for more water, someone laughing in the soft way people laugh when they are still half asleep and trying not to wake a baby. A chicken scolded a dog, or maybe it was a dog scolding a chicken. The lake sang its usual rolling shshshshh against the rocks. It was all normal and just another morning, except it wasn't, not after the face. When I say face, I mean a skull. And when I say skull, I mean the small stone bundle that held a skull like a secret inside it, wrapped up as tenderly as a newborn in white bandages wet with plaster. But that came later, after the shouting and the stillness and the careful hands. In the beginning it was only a morning that smelled like wet rope, when I, who was 12 and full of wind and questions I did not ask, thought only of how many omena the women would net at the inlet near the papyrus and whether my father might not be too proud to let me work for the mjalugo woman in trousers. On Ruzinga, everyone knew everyone and everything. If a goat escaped, by the time you reached the third homestead someone on their veranda was already chewing on a story about it. So of course we knew about the visitors who dug and brushed and scraped at the hillsides like patient goats. They'd come before, and people said they'd come again until the island sunk into the lake or the lake drank them whole. They made little squares with string and hammered nails into the ground and then they crouched for hours with toothbrushes and tiny picks. They counted things that didn't look like anything to me, at least in the beginning. Chips of enamel, yes, sometimes a tooth that looked like a boiled bean with little mountains on it. But the seeds, the little black stones they collected by the handful, the inch of jaw, the perfect ribs of a leaf printed in rock, I didn't understand how those little dead things could make the mjalugo woman in trousers smile like she'd been given a sweet mango. We called her Mama Kamba at first, because she wore strings of beads in a way that looked like the women from across the lake, and because names slip and land where they land. But that wasn't right. She wasn't Kamba, and she wasn't Lugo, and she wasn't Jishi either, even though she could curse like one when she banged her shin on a stone or the Primus refused to catch. Her name was Mary. She wore trousers that made her look like a boy from far away, and she tied a scarf around her head that was always dusted at the edges, and she squinted in the sun like it was a personal enemy. She held a cigarette sometimes like she was holding a carpenter's nail between her fingers. I never saw her drop it, I saw her stub them out carefully. She smelled like dust and pencil shavings and that sharp perfume of gasoline from the stove, and sometimes like oranges if they had oranges. Neothai, she called the first morning I dared to stand at the edge of their camp and pretend to kick at the earth while actually not missing any of the good parts. Neothai. Child. Everyone called me that when they did not know my name, and sometimes even when they did. You, she said, pointing with the end of her pencil. Do you have eyes like a hawk, or like a chick? I didn't know enough of her English then. But I knew hawk and chick. So I pointed to my own eyes and tried to open them as wide as the tilapia market. Everyone laughed. It was the kind of laugh that didn't feel like it was trying to flatten me. He's got eyes, said one of the men, Owar, who worked sometimes for them and sometimes for my father when he sewed new floats onto our nets. He was my uncle, but in our way of talking, all of our men older than us are uncle and all our women older than us are mother. He had the big chest of a man who throws nets and the patient hands of a man who untangles them. He looked at me. Oceano, right? A Kenyese boy. I nodded. When you are 12, it burns a little to be named as belonging to your mother before your father, like they couldn't find enough of you on your own. But I didn't say anything because I liked the way Owar said my mother's name, like water being poured into a bowl. Come, Mary said, and she had already turned to walk. I liked how she walked, like a heron, delicate and sudden at the same time, weight on the balls of her feet, eyes cutting across the ground. She took me to where a square had been cut into the hillside and a man was brushing the earth as if it were a sleeping child's hair. Look, she said. See this line? The yellow clay. And this? This is darker, because it was a place where fire burned. Do you see? No. One day you will. And here she knelt, and her trousers bunched at the knee, and she set her face very close to the ground. Tell me what you see. I saw dirt and a pebble and an ant carrying something 10 times its size. I saw the tender dark eyes of a millipede twist away into a crack. I saw nothing important. I said nothing. Let him get used to it, the man with the brush said. He spoke like the white men in Kisumu, tight at the corners, like he was holding onto his words because they wanted to leave his mouth too fast. You cannot show every child everything at once. But I wanted her to think I had hawk eyes, so I squinted until my face hurt. Then I saw it a little white curve, like the edge of a shell. It was so faint that when I closed one eye and then the other it almost disappeared. I put my finger near it, not touching, as I'd seen them do. There. I said. I didn't mean to let my voice jump like that, but it did. She smiled, and I loved her then the way you can love a stranger when they let you be clever. Yes, she said. Bone. My father said I could work for her as long as I still went out with him for Omina at dusk and still moved the goats in if the clouds began to stack like ugly in the afternoon. He is a very tall man, my father, and when he is cross his shadow is long and the peaky boys ride around it without touching the edges. He is not often cross. You will not believe me when I say that, because all boys say that about their fathers. But mine is gentle, like he is made of the inside of a plantain. He is careful with nets, careful with words, careful as a man who has seen debt flatten a family and knows how long it takes to press that wet cloth into shape again. He only said one thing that made me touch my tongue to my teeth and wonder if he was angry. He said, you will be paid, and you will be polite, and you will not bring those people's disagreements into my house. What disagreements? I asked, because I had not yet learned that when a grown-up weighs a word in his mouth like that he is telling a whole book with only the one word. He looked at the lake instead of at me. The lake looks back at you, if you let it. It is the only thing I know that can be many colors at once and still be itself. They disagree about how old is, he said. I did not understand. But I remembered it. The body does that for us sometimes, keeps a little folded piece of something under the tongue until we need it. I became the boy who was the first to fill the wash basin in the morning and the last to sweep the trench at night. I became the boy who made tea in enamel mugs and the boy who ran back to the village for more sugar, because of course nobody wanted tea without sugar, as if we were goats. I became the boy who knew which tin kept the paint brushes and which tin kept the dental picks and which tin kept the little squares of paper with numbers written on them that matched a number in Mary's notebook. I liked her notebook best. It was a fat thing that bulged like a pregnant goat and had a scab of brown dirt at the top corner. She always licked her finger before flipping a page, and there were smears of graphite on her hands, and sometimes I thought I could hear the dry rasp of the pencil even when she wasn't yet writing. Once, I traced a drawing she'd made of a tooth. It was a molar, with 4 little mountains and a valley you could get lost in. There were hatch marks here and here to show where it had been worn, and something written in her sharp hand that said, "P-occlusal surface. Fruit eater." I did not know what occlusal was, and I didn't think I should ask, because I had come to understand without anyone telling me that sometimes adults hold their knowledge like a gourd of milk. They will pour it, but only for those who can carry the bowl without spilling. I was clumsy. But she let me look. She let me hold the paper up to the light and see the thinness of it and the press of the pencil lines, and she let me hold the tooth itself, heavy and dense and small as a knuckle. It was like holding a secret that doesn't know it is a secret. Niase ogwethi, Owar said once under his breath when she passed the tooth to me. God bless you. He meant it kindly. Mary's mouth turned up at one corner. She would smile and then pull her face very straight again, like she was reminding it not to be silly. I liked that. I hated in myself the way my own face gave everything away. The first time she said the word that would live between my ears for the rest of my life, we were at the foot of a slope where broom grass ate at everything and there was a fig tree with big leaves casting a patch of shadow that changed shape the way a kite's shadow does as it skates up and down the ground. She used a stick to draw in the dust, a long line that stood for time, a bump where the trees were thick and a little puff at the end where humans stood. Miocene, she said carefully. She looked at me the way a farmer looks at the sky before deciding to plant. Miocene. It's a word from the people who like to collect words and put them in rows. It means long ago, but not the longest ago. On this island, the rocks are from that age, from that long ago time. There were forests here then, hot and full of fruit. Things fell in the mud and were buried and turned to stone. And now we take them back out. In my mind, the hillside became a different color because of that word, as if she had salted it and the water had come running to fill the flavor. What things? I asked. Leaves, she said, and she pulled a small slab from her satchel and brushed at it with her fingers. The paper-thin ghost of a leaf shone there, the veins like writing. Seed pods. Snails. And bones. She looked at me, and then she did a thing I did not know grown ups did. She looked at me like I could take in exactly as much as I could take in and no more, and then she stopped talking. She did not go on and make noise to fill the air. It was as if she had set a bowl in front of me and then looked away so I would not feel watched as I ate my fill. And the bones? I said. Whose bones? Monkeys, she said first, because that was safe. And the ones who weren't monkeys anymore. But not people, I said, because even then I knew this. Even when we could not say it in the way of men who write books, we could say it in the way of boys who can tell the difference between a fish that will bite and a fish who only looks like it will bite. There were no people at that time. Everyone knew that, even if some people did not want to say it. Not people, she agreed. Apes. Not quite like the ones that live now. Not quite like the monkeys either. Something from the beginning of the branch. They have a name, proconsul. She said it the way you say a prayer you have learned recently, carefully not to drop a syllable or trip on a vowel. It means something like before consul, which doesn't mean much to us, but it means old in the way that people who think they are the center of things say old. Don't worry about the name. It is a face I am after, though. A skull. I have dreamed a little about it. She said it and then she sat very still, like saying it had woken up a bird that might fly away if she moved suddenly. I didn't call her silly. I had dreams too that touched me in the elbow. Sometimes at night I woke up and I could see the island wearing a different skin. Not grass but leaves, big leaves that collected the rain and threw it down in wet slaps. Not goats but something else, something fussier, clambering and shouting and suddenly silent. Not people but the possibility of people, like the smell of smoke before you know from which house it is coming. The day of the face was a day like any other, which is a way of saying it was full of things you could list and then forget. The gulls squabbled, and the line for the tea was long, and the man whose job it was to keep the paraffin tin capped forgot, and the whole tent smelled like a paint shop. Someone sang a rude song under their breath, and one of the boys from the next homestead, whose face I never liked because it was too quick to smile at other people's stumbles, tried to get me to sell him the drawing pencil I had made disappear from Mary's table. I didn't sell it. I put it back, and later I saw the small dent my temptation had left in the dust. We went up. The trench was in a place where the slope looked like the temple of someone who had forgotten their god, half fallen down and full of grass. There was a line of rocks along the contour that looked like the back of 100 dozing crocodiles. The string square from the day before was still there, its pegs dark with moisture. We had not walked there yet. It felt new, even though it was very old. Mary took the trench behind the string where the soil was a little lighter and had a scatter of tiny chalky nodules. Calcium carbonate, the brush man always said, like he was telling me the secret of life, and I just didn't hear it properly. She crouched. Her scarf slipped a little at the side and I saw the pale of her hair, not quite gold, not quite like any of us had. "Neothai," she said, and I felt my body prick up like a dog hearing a rabbit in the grass. "Brush this in front of me. Gentle. Don't dig. Don't press. Invite the loose to come away." I wanted to do it perfectly. I wanted to do it like she did. The dry soil was friable, like a biscuit that has been left too long under the sun and now decides to give up and crumble. I brushed, and the brush made a faint chf noise. Dust rose and rolled and settled. The line between the lighter and the darker soil grew clearer, not because I made it so but because the brushing revealed it. I don't even remember the moment we saw it. That is the strangest thing. I remember my own breathing in my ears. I remember a bee, heavy with pollen, strike my cheek and then lift away, indignant. I remember the taste of iron at the back of my mouth because I had bitten my tongue. But the moment of sight itself? It's as if my mind was looking at something else at precisely that moment and only came back in time to remember the afters. Mary's breath paused. That's how I knew first. She breathed all day without me noticing, the way you do when you are awake. But then she stopped, and the air around us seemed to wait too. "Don't move," she said, so soft I almost thought I had imagined it. "Don't move, Oceano." I didn't move. My body learned a new trick in that second. Everything that wanted to move, my fingers, the muscles of my eyes, my tongue, became good for something more helpful, waiting. The thing in front of us looked like nothing. Brown on brown, a small curve the color of an old banana peel. But her hand hovered, and she did not smile, and her eyes had gone flat the way the lake sometimes goes flat when the hippo sighs, and so I knew. "Bone," she whispered. "Skull." The brush man came, and then war came because of course you cannot keep good news in a trench. The others did not come because Mary was a woman who said don't and then people did not. That is a kind of power I had never seen before. She did not need to shout or wave her arms. She only had to lay down a line with her voice and everyone's feet remembered how to stop in front of it. "See," she said to me, but not like she meant to test me, like she wanted to share something and wouldn't know it fully unless someone else saw it with her. This curve is the top of a brain case. Here, look, just peeping out of the matrix. And here this might be the brow. Lord. All right. No more brushing. We will trench around. We will give it room. Oceano, tell them to fetch the water and the plaster. Do not tell them why. Just say hurry. My legs were useless as new goats. I ran anyway, like my body remembers a running I had practiced. Down the slope, past the fig tree, past the beautiful lizard with a tail that moved like a piece of ribbon. I didn't trip, not even once. The world had gone so bright that it almost was not there. Water, I said to the boys who had been arguing over whether the teapot could be used for soup. Plaster. Now. 3 pairs of eyes looked at me, calculating. I added, she says hurry. The Primus hissed. The kettle banged once. We ran. The plaster came in a white bag that had printed on it in a language I didn't know with letters that looked like dancing bones. We sliced it open with a knife that had already lived 2 lives and shaved a thumb thin as a plantain in one of them. We filled a basin and stirred, and the plaster threw up 1,000 tiny clouds, and my nose itched and I did not scratch it because the powder would go everywhere. The water went milky. The plaster stiffened into a kind of porridge. Quick, quick, the men wetted strips of cloth that had once been a shirt in a city I did not yet know the name of. They draped them over each other on the Primus rack to catch the drips. You are thinking this is not the way people preserve the head of a thing like a person. Ah, but this wasn't a person, it was older than that and more fragile, and that made it more important and more particular. Back at the trench, the air felt like the room in our house where my mother keeps the gourd of sour milk, thick with sour importance, and if you laugh it will go wrong. Mary had cut away, slowly, slowly, the soil around the curve. She had taught me how to look for the way soil changes color and how all the little grains point themselves toward the thing they are hiding. Now I could see the glisten of bone in 3 places, and the shape of it made a little joke with my eyes. It wanted to be one thing and I knew it was another. It wanted to be an old coconut shell. It wanted to be a round turtle that had gone to sleep. It wanted to be a jaw. But it was a head. Try not to breathe too hard, Mary said, and we all smiled because who could ever do that? Breathing is like sleeping and the heart beating, you can only hold the reins for a few jumps and then your horse will run anyway. Owar went around the edges with the small pick, not touching the bone, making a moat. He had good hands for that, hands that knew how to stop before they went a sliver too far. It is a good thing to know how to pull up just before the trouble, to let the moment breathe around you and do its work without you pressing too hard. When the trench around was wide enough, Mary touched the bone itself. It is the most frightening thing, to touch something that has slept for longer than any story you have ever heard and know that you could injure it by knowing it with your hand too roughly. But she had a way. She had a way of pressing the pad of her finger at the edges, not the center, and of looking not at the finger but at the bone to watch how it took the touch, like a child looking at a goat as she learned to milk it, watching for the flicker of fear so she can stop before it begins. We will bandage it in place, she said. The brush man was already dipping the strip. It dripped and the drop made a circle on the ground that dried like a slice of moon. Owar held the first strip in the air to allow the extra to drip off and then handed it to Mary, who laid it across the top of the skull and the soil around it, pressing gently. The plaster was warm. I learned then that some things warm as they become hard, that there are heats besides fire. They layered 3, 4, 10 strips, fanning them and overlapping them and making a cradle that would harden into a white shell. The fragrance of wet cloth and plaster and soil was like a kind of medicine. We all leaned in. Someone coughed discreetly into the crook of his arm, and it seemed very loud. "Leave it," Mary said, when the white had lost its shine. "Let it take its shape." "What is it like, that waiting?" "It is like waiting for the fish to pull the float under after you have seen the shadow in the water. It is like waiting for your mother to lift the cloth that covers the pot to see whether the ugly has set. It is like waiting for rain when the clouds pile up like goats in a pen and the thunder licks its lips but does not yet bite. It is possible to wait too hard. You have to learn how to let the future move toward you on its own legs." We sat under the fig for a while. Mary did not smoke then. She was too excited or too afraid. Excited and afraid, the things that make you forget your hands. She drank tea, even though it was milky and too sweet, and she smiled at me without looking, the way mothers sometimes smile at the baby they have set down next to them while they do something else. I felt taller than I had any right to feel. I felt as if I were the tree and she had tied her string to me to measure out her square and had found me worthy. "What if it's nothing?" the brush man asked, and we all glared at him because men who say such things at those times are either brave or foolish, and you cannot tell which until later. "What if it's just he made a shape with his hand that could have been a coconut or an egg or a turtle shell? And not a skull?" Mary had a way with the word no. She turned and looked at him and said, "No," as if she were untangling a line that had snagged on a thorn. "There. Now it was free. It is a skull. I did not come here just to learn the names of rocks, James." So it was James. And it was a skull. And that day the island gave it to us, after we had waited as long as plaster takes to stop being wanting to be hard and become hard. They undercut the bandage tent with the pick, gently, gently, and it rose up like a white turtle from the sand, the brown earth still clinging to it like a blanket. A war blew gently at the edge and a breath of dust rose and fell. They flipped it without flipping, turning it as if it were a sleeping baby they did not want to wake, and there, in the brown bottom, we saw the shape of the face. It was a face, all right. The bone was fragile, but the eyes were obvious, the curve of the brow, the swell of the cheekbone. The teeth winked like the tiny white stones you find in a riverbed when the water is very clean and the sun is at your back. A shout rose in my chest. Mary put her hand out without looking and I swallowed the shout like a fish, whole. The world went very quiet then. The lake forgot to shh. The gulls flew without crying. Even the boys who would normally slam their laughter around the slope held it in their teeth. "What is the word?" I asked, because sometimes there is a word that makes a thing more fully itself. "What is it?" She said it the way people say a name at a baptism. "Proconsul," she whispered. "Early Miocene. A face from an old forest." I had seen my mother hold a newborn and press her nose to the hair and breathe like she was drinking something sweet that might spill. Mary did that with the air above the skull. She didn't touch it. She breathed it. Then she sat back on her heels and rubbed at her eyes with her knuckles like a tired girl and smiled at me with her mouth open, showing that she did not know yet what the inside of her mouth looked like now that her face had seen this new thing. "That," she said, sounding as if she had been running and had only just now found a place to stop. "That is a thing worth walking up a hill for." We took it down, the white turtle with the face in its belly. We set it on a table that had been a crate that had been a box. Mary put a cloth over it as if it were a person. People came. Not everyone, but the ones who had been working and the ones who knew how to stand near something without disturbing it with their voices. Othwal the herdsman came because he owed a war a favor and had been sent. He wore his hat tilted back and looked like a boy trying to remember how to be a man. He peered and then he made the little noise we make when a fish is bigger than we expect when it rises. Oh. Just air, only air. Mary smiled without looking at him. She wrote quickly in her book, the date, the square, the level, the weather. She measured angles and scribbled a tiny map. Then she drew. I had never seen her draw in front of people before, and so I was ready to be unimpressed, because the people who do things well often do not translate that skill to the crowd. But she drew with a gentleness that made my jaw hurt and a speed that made my heart run. The brow, the orbit, the crest, lines that said more than lines should be able to say. It is a gift, to see and make the seeing visible for someone else. Look, she said, and she made two short lines at an angle on either side of the nose. Zygomatic arch cheekbone. Not like a monkey's, no, something else. And the teeth, see those molars? Rounded. Fruit. A forest mouth. She didn't say, the shoulders did this or the wrists did that. Those were words for later, I would learn them. She did not say tail or no tail, not then, though later she would laugh and say that if we kept finding proconsul without any tail bones it would be, to her mind, bad form for it to turn out that it had a tail after all. Scientists make jokes like that, dry as cassava. After a while, the day came back. The lake started up its shshshshh. The boys ran up to the fig and tried to spit into a bird's nest, missing spectacularly. A woman came to sell us bananas and smirked with her mouth closed when she saw the way we were all looking at a stone that looked like a face and nothing else at all. The brush man, James, tried to touch the edge of the skull and Mary said no without looking, like a mother whose baby is sleeping and whose hand reaches out to steady the string of the hanging cradle without lifting her eyes from her work. There are moments after big moments that are like small animals that come to the edge of the clearing and then dart away before you can name them. I watched them all. O wore wiping his hands on his shirt not because they were dirty but because they felt musty with too much stillness. The fig leaf that came loose and drifted down and caught on the string at the edge of the trench and hung there like a little flag. The smell of plaster that had spilled a drop on the table and now glued a corner of paper to the wood. Mary's hand going to her scarf and then stopping before it adjusted it and letting the scarf do what it wanted. James pretending to measure the humidity as if the number would put a boundary around what had just happened. We made a cradle in a wooden box for the skull and covered it and set it in the shade. They would send it to Nairobi when the motorboat came next, to the Corindon Museum, where people with hands as careful as Mary's would coax the mud away and let the face come all the way out. They would do it behind windows and under lights. But here on the island we had already seen it. We would have to stitch our mouths a little, because the story was a shy one, and because the ones who liked to put their names on things were not always the ones who had turned their eyes to the ground and waited. That is a lesson men like my father know and pretend not to, because it makes your chest ache. That evening my mother made omena with tomatoes and onions and we ate it with ugali that was still a little too soft because she had poured the flour too soon. We laughed at it and she laughed too and said we were greedy and impatient as men always are when they've done nothing and are given food. My sister, Ashino, rolled the ugali into little balls to fling at me and pretended to miss and then didn't, exactly. The house smelled like fish and salt and smoke and something else I only later came to think of as good hunger. My father drank his tea. He is a man who drinks tea as if he has been asked to hold something delicate in his mouth and has accepted the task gladly. You saw it, he said, not as a question, but as a kind of acceptance. I nodded. I could not speak because there were some stones in my chest that had not yet settled into their holes. His shadow flickered against the wall when someone walked by outside with a lamp. The bones are old. But they are not our grandparents, he said, and I flinched because to say that feels like you are being unkind to the skull. He saw and softened his voice. Or not our grandparents in the way of our clans. They are, kin in another way. You will hear many mouths make many shapes around it. Hear them. But do not let any one mouth be the only one you hear. My father is a fisherman. He is also a philosopher anyway, like all fishermen who have had the dark full of their breath and the stars and the whispers of water in their bones. He did not need to have a word for Miocene to know what he meant. He had been there in the dark with his thoughts and a string of floats and silence, and that is all you need, sometimes, to understand time. That night I could not sleep. The island was still and noisy at the same time. The goats made their little throat noises, the lake talked to itself in a cracked whisper, someone coughed and turned over on a mat and the mat said a complaint. But inside my head, a forest had grown. It was not the green the first knew, it was bigger and the leaves were thicker and they had a secret gloss. The air was heavy, like the breath of a cow. The figs were round and sweet, the kind that makes your lips sticky. Something moved in that forest. There were no people. There was only the climbing and the leaping and the sleeping and the breaking of branches and the clicking of fruit in teeth and the occasional hiss as something impatient told something else to stop. In the dream I sat very still and then a shape came out and sat in front of me and it looked at me with eyes that were wondering what a boy was and why he had such a flat face, and then it reached and touched my toe, which had a scab from a seed pod, and then it went away. When I woke, the scab was still there. I ran to the camp very early the next morning. The light had only just crept sideways from the horizon, and the dew made little cold knives that stabbed the tops of my feet when I brushed through the grass. The plaster had hardened all the way. Flies walked on it. There is something rude about flies walking on holy things. I pressed my hands to the side of the wooden box where the skull lay, not to touch it, I knew better. Just to feel the coolness of the wood against my palm. When I pulled away, the dust from the box imprinted the lines of my hand like a ghost. I could see how the flesh wore the bones underneath. Mary came up behind me like a big cat, silent despite the gravel. You should be home, she said, but kindly. She looked like she had not slept either, and like she had slept fiercely when she did and had wrestled with her pillow the way boys do when they dream they are fighting. I wanted to see it again, I said. It made no sense, as you do not see it when the wrapper is on it, but I said it anyway. You may. She did not lift the cloth. We stood quietly, and I felt like I had been given a gift. It is strange to be given the gift of quiet, but it is stranger still not to see that it is a gift and to ask aloud for more. When people talk about Mary, they talk about her with Eve-sounding words like extraordinary and formidable. I liked those words when I learned them later, but they don't taste like who she was to me then. To me, she was a person who could stand very still and still fill up the air, and a person who liked oranges and peeled them into a single long strip if she could manage it, and a person who cursed good-naturedly when her trousers caught on thorn, and a person who could draw the idea of a thing as if she had taken a little spoon and scooped it out of the center of the world. She was also the first white person I had met who wore her work in front of her as if it were a necklace she had made and liked better than any other she had ever seen. The others I had known on the road, in the market, at the mission wore other people's work around their necks and seemed to be always reaching for their own while looking around as if afraid someone would notice. Maybe I am unkind. But she stood there with the box and the skull inside it and all the words she could have said, and she did not say them because saying them would have been like pulling too hard on a fish that is taking your line. Later she spoke. When I first came to this lake, she said, I thought it would be like the other lakes. And it is. It is water, and it is fish and the birds that tempt themselves with the fish, and it is wind. But there is something here. She touched the wood. There is a skin over everything. If you do not learn how to look, you never see that skin. But once you learn to look, you see it everywhere. I did not think she meant a real skin. I thought she meant time. But she did not say it. She did not need to. Some things you say and they shrink. Some things you keep in your hands and they warm there and grow. I wanted to have such a thing in my hands. I wanted my hands to be worthy. The boat came 2 days later. It groaned when they gave it the box as if the box weighed as much as a grown cow, even though it did not. The men with their shirts off carried it out, taking small steps, making their own music with their footprints on the wet planking of the jetty. I was not big enough to be allowed to carry it, but I walked in front on the path and at the edge of my vision I could see the way the box shivered a little with the small changes in their grip. Mary walked behind like a shepherd following a new flock, eyes on the curve of the world, as if it might rise to bump her and she would push back kindly. There was a motorboat and a man in a hat who held onto ropes like a man who had forgotten he had hands. He looked at the box and at Mary and at the men and did not know how to make his face do the mixture of seriousness and respect and greed that belonged there. Mary took pity on him and arranged her face for him. She had learnt that, I saw. You do not get to choose the faces other people need, you only get to choose whether you will meet them with your own. The box went into the boat. The rope strained. The first wave slapped the side of the hull like a stubborn uncle. The men climbed in and settled their bodies, and the boat pushed off with a noise like a snake clearing its throat. The lake made a path and then mended the path again as if nothing had ever cut it. Mary watched until the boat was a line and then a dot and then absorbed by the water like salt. She stood for a long time. I saw her mouth move once. I did not hear the word. "Come on," she said at last. "There is more hillside. We have to see where the bones were lying. It will tell us whether our ape fell out of a tree or whether its friends piled leaves on it like we do when we bury our dead." "You bury your dead with leaves?" I asked, interested not so much in the dead but in whether other people's funerals were as dusty as ours. "No," she said, smiling. "Not in that way. But the land sometimes gives the truth a nudge. That afternoon, we found seeds. They were small lumps, black and shining in the dirt, like the eyes of fish that you find in the pot after you've eaten everything else and then wonder briefly what to do with them before you decide to be brave and chew and then pretend you have always done this. There were leaf prints like the one in her satchel but better, with veins like river deltas. There was a piece of branch, its wood turned to stone, its bark crisp as though it had died the day before. And there were more bones, not of our face friend but of something that had been its neighbor, a monkey, perhaps, with teeth like very small almonds, and a jaw with a curve that made you think of a question mark. "Forest," Mary said, her hand moving across the ground like a fly and not touching. "Fruit. We might even find coprolites if we are friendly with luck." "Coprolites?" I asked, because I was ready for any new word she wanted to give me. "Poo," she said, her mouth twitching with pleasure at my expression. "Old poo that turned to stone. That's what I want. That would tell us what our friend ate." I laughed then and didn't stop for a minute and she laughed too and then we both stopped because other people were not in that particular laugh and it's rude to carry your laughter like a radio into other people's space. The idea that POO could be a treasure was so wonderful that I felt like I might die and be reborn slightly better. Days went by. We settled into the work as if we had always done it. The hill wore our handprints and our footprints like paint. The path up became wider, the stones at its edges polished with our passing. The figs took our shade and gave it back. We found teeth and jaw bits and seeds and leaves and once a tiny frog encased in a knot of stone like a sweet in sugar. We found a piece of wrist bone with a curve that made Mary sit down on the ground and say oh in a way that made me want to punch the air. Later, when I learned more, I learned why the wrist is important, that it tells you how an animal moved through its trees, whether it loved to swing, whether it walked along the branches carefully like we walk along the edge of the canoe. But then I only knew that something about that bend meant that our friend had held the world a certain way. People came. Not many. Someone from the district office who wore socks even in the heat like his feet were shy. A man from Kisumu who had a camera as big as a bread oven and who made us stand very still and then asked us to stand still again because his thing had stuck. A woman with a laugh like a song and a way of saying really? That made people half a head taller. They all looked. They all asked their questions. Some of the questions made Mary's mouth go flat.